Welcome back to Face the Nation. The big political question for 2018 is whether Republicans will build on their single-party control of Congress or whether Democrats will flip control of the Senate, the House, or both. For a look at where things stand as we move into 2018, we turn to Dan Balls, who is the chief correspondent at The Washington Post. His colleague, Karen Tumulty, is a national political correspondent, and our own Anthony Salvanto is the CBS News Director of Elections. All right, first, we're going to get to the House and the Senate and break those down, but I want to just start with a very broad question for all three of you. Dan, I'll start with you. What does the landscape look like here at the end of 2017 for next year's elections?
Everything we see at this point, John, is it is a very, very difficult landscape for the Republicans. Almost every measure or every event that has happened so far this year politically has been bad for the Republicans and good for the Democrats. You can look at it in terms of the president's approval rating, which is historically low for a first-term president. You can look at it in the nature of the current preference for how the House should break. The Democrats have a significant advantage on that at this point. And we know that from the recent elections, the enthusiasm is much greater, or appears to be much greater, among Democrats than Republicans to turn out, and that's often the key indicator in midterm elections.
Karen?
It's true. Midterm elections, especially in a president's first term, are almost never good news for the president. In fact, only twice since 1934 has a president's party picked up seats in the first midterm of his first term in office. But it really does seem like the Republicans are, in fact, heading into some really tough weather here. And it's true, the generic ballot, would you rather see a Democrat or a Republican in office? The Democrats are ahead in that by double digits. But I agree. I think this enthusiasm gap is really the biggest thing the Republicans ought to be worried about right now.
I want to get at the roots of that enthusiasm and where it comes from. But Anthony, where do you put the needle down on the record here?
Well, let me temper that a little bit. The math is still a little bit in the advantage of the Republicans, at least on the Senate side. And the reason for that is that the Democrats are defending more seats. And anytime that happens, you have a harder hill to climb. And look, on the House side, it's true that we see in national polling that more people are now saying that they'd like to see the Democrats in control. But remember that those polls are talking to people in very heavy Democratic districts as well as heavy Republican ones. And so that generic ballot can sort of overstate the case, right? What you really want to focus on is how many specific House seats could be competitive. And on that side, there may be just enough for the Democrats to put the House in play. The real question going forward is, can they expand that map? Can they make more seats that we wouldn't ordinarily think are in play sort of come into view?
On that generic ballot, though, isn't it the case, this question of would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat, even though it's an imprecise number, when it's that big, when people are favoring the Democrat that much, isn't that sort of, while a blunt indicator, when the number's that big, it still does tell you something, though, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It gives you a general sense of the direction. And there's no question that that direction is pointing towards Democrats. It's maybe about half as many. So if you see a national ballot, national generic ballot, you say, well, they might win maybe half that much in the actual elections. But there again, the interesting thing is going to be where they can start to try to persuade people. And as you look around the country, a lot of these suburban districts, a lot of wealthier districts that had gone Republican on economic issues particularly, are places that they're targeting. And if they can start to put those in play, then we start to see a really competitive House election.
I think the first place to look will be there are 23 House districts, and the Democrats have to pick up 24. There are 23 House districts where there is a Republican incumbent sitting in a district that was won by Hillary Clinton. And these districts are all over the country. They're in California, Texas, Florida, and they're a big range. A lot of them are suburban, but a lot of them are rural, and a lot of them have large numbers of Hispanics.
John, there's one other element in terms of the tempering of where we are. We have a odd situation, which is a president with very low approval ratings at a time when you have historically, or over the last 17 years, the lowest unemployment rate, a stock market that, as the president says constantly, is breaking records weekly, and steady economic growth. So for the Republicans, if they can, in one way or another, force people to think about the state of the economy rather than their view of the president, they could hope to do better than a lot of this polling suggests at this point. History says that there have been 2 other times in the last half century where you've had this anomaly of low presidential approval and low unemployment. In both those cases, the presidential approval turned out to be the more significant, and the party in power lost a lot of seats.
Yeah. In the last 3 midterms, most people have said that their midterm vote is about the president. So there's no question that he's a factor, and there's no question that approval rating looks like.
And that's where the enthusiasm you're talking about, Karen, comes from. Explain that for people a little bit about. It's linked to the president, right?
And what pollsters ask voters is, you know, how excited are you about this election? How they look for other measures of how engaged people are with the fact that there even is an election this year. And just this week, the Wall Street Journal, Peter Hart, their pollster, just found a 10-point enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans.
You know, that's really important, too, because remember, in midterms, turnout is lower. And the folks who tend to vote are a little disproportionately older and often disproportionately Republican, at least recently. What the Democrats have taken out of these last couple of elections in Virginia and Alabama is that they can motivate their base, that people who don't ordinarily come out, except for in presidential years, have been willing to come out. And if they can do that, then that changes the dynamic, because there are folks sitting in these districts who normally sit out midterms, where turnout goes under 40% a lot of times. They reshape that, and the whole electorate changes.
Dan, let me ask you about the Senate. Karen sketched out the situation in the House. In the Senate, after Doug Jones of Alabama is seated as the Democrat next year, after that exciting race this year, there will be a 2-seat majority for Republicans. That means that Democrats need to just pick up 2 seats to gain control of the Senate. Now, 10 Democrats are up for re-election in states that Donald Trump won. And in recent history, states have tended to vote for senator the way they have for president, so that's one factor there. There's only one Republican running in a state where Hillary Clinton won. That's in Nevada, Dean Heller. And then there are some other interesting states, Tennessee, and then Minnesota are on, and those are. So where do you see the Senate shaking out?
Well, I'd make 2 points. First of all, if we were having this conversation a year ago, we would be talking about the likelihood of potentially significant losses for the Democrats in the Senate because, as you say, they're defending so many seats, and they're defending them in states that Trump won. Now, of those 10 that Trump won, 5 are truly red and 5 are what I would call more swing states. But what's happened over the course of the year is, because of the turbulence that the Republicans have run into, there is now at least the possibility of Democrats being able to take control of the Senate. I think it's still very, very difficult, but they have 3 opportunities: Arizona, Nevada, and possibly Tennessee, because they have a candidate there, the former Democratic governor, who may be the only Democrat who could win statewide, but I'm not predicting at this point that he will. And many of their incumbents are in reasonably good shape, or better shape than you might have thought 6 or 8 or 10 months ago. I think it's still a heavy lift for the Democrats to take over, but they at least have an opportunity which they wouldn't have dreamed of at the beginning of the Trump presidency.
Karen, when Dan talks about some of those Senate seats being in kind of more swingy areas, then, so you've got the class of seats that are up where Democrats are trying to defend territory in West Virginia, where I think Trump won by 45 points. Then others are in Michigan, Wisconsin, which were closer. So how do you think, is that the distinction, another one we should be watching for, those Rust Belt states that flipped and went for Trump in the presidential, where people were surprised? How do you think that'll play out in the Senate elections?
Well, as it turns out, I spent some time this week in Michigan, and actually looking at the governor's race there. What I found is that Democrats on that sort of activist base, the kind of people who are engaged now, are so traumatized by seeing what they thought were going to be easy wins for Hillary Clinton last time around that that also contributes to the enthusiasm factor. They were caught napping in 2016, and there is a determination, I think, not to have that happen again.
And Anthony, another thing we should talk about with respect to the Senate is there are primaries to come. We saw in Alabama some extraordinary inter-party Republican fighting, comments, people even saying they were no longer Republicans after the Republican National Committee supported Roy Moore. How do you think the primary process plays out in terms of, well, just how do you think it plays out?
Yeah, definitely the thing to watch this spring. We could be sitting here a year from now, and the landscape will be very different because, look, behind all of this is which direction does each party go? Right? And the Republicans are still having that conversation. We talked a lot about the sort of the more populist wing of the party, the part that is, voting against anything seen as the establishment, anything seen as the elites, versus the more traditional conservative wing. And if you start to see primary challenges to sitting incumbent Republican senators in otherwise safe states, then you start to get a dynamic like you saw, or like many people think you saw in Alabama, where the Republicans could potentially nominate someone who can't appeal to a broader electorate, and then you get a potentially safe red seat that becomes in play. Look, it's the same thing on the Democratic side. I mean, they're still going to have a conversation about which direction their party goes. And so both parties are going to have to set that.
Dan, is that Democratic conversation delayed, though, by Democrats thinking, look, if we just run kind of against the president, we take advantage of this enthusiasm from our base, let's postpone the question about what exactly the Democratic Party means because we got a chance to play off of this? Or is there going to be a real conversation?
I think there will be a partial conversation, but I think at this point, for most Democrats, the view is the harder they can go after the president and tie their Republican opponent to the president, the better off they're going to do, and they will defer that conversation about who they are as a party for the 2020 Democratic nomination battle. They may pay some price for that. I'm not understating how significant that challenge will be for them, but I think for the midterm, focusing on the president. I mean, one of the problems that Republican candidates potentially face is how much do they identify with President Trump in order to energize their base, and the cost of that in a general election if they become so identified that people think, well, it's just another Trumpian.
Right, the challenge that Ed Gillespie ran into in the Virginia gubernatorial race.
And there's also, though, you're finding that a lot of these Republicans who are running for the Senate are not willing, for instance, to commit to voting for Mitch McConnell to continue as their leader as well. I mean, on the one hand, they don't want to be too close to the establishment. On the other, they don't want to offend the base. So it's really a delicate act for a lot of them.
Anthony, how much do you think it's a danger for Democrats to not have something to run on, to just focus on the president? Because obviously, if they focus on the president, that encourages the Republican base to turn out.
One of the things that was so interesting in 2016, where, as you mentioned, the Democrats didn't win as many seats as some thought they might, is that voters said Donald Trump was a different kind of Republican. He was kind of a brand unto himself. And they had a hard time tying the Republican Senate candidate to Donald Trump. The question to watch is whether or not they can do that now, because so many people have seen the president as sort of different brand altogether. And
the Washington Post, a paper you're familiar with, wrote a piece about how the president's dying to get out there and campaign. We know all presidents love to get out and back in campaigns. It's so much more fun than what they have to do in Washington. But how does that work out, Dan? Is this going to be a situation where people think, go campaign somewhere else, Mr. President, or he just spends his time in those safe districts? And how do you think that plays out, his active participation?
Well, we know that he loves to get out, and we know that those big rallies energize him, and that he loves to do that, and that that he creates enthusiasm as well as receives the energy back from it. He's going to want to be out there a fair amount. I think it will be difficult for a lot of these candidates to embrace him too closely in some of these competitive races, and so I think individually all of those candidates are going to have to decide, how close do I want the president to be? Ed Gillespie, talking about Virginia, wanted to keep him somewhat at arm's length. It didn't matter in the end. He still got beat pretty badly.
Kieran, how do you think the policy landscape is going to show up here? Are we going to have a bunch of fights that are going to be all about kind of values issues, cultural issues, the things that get voters excited? Or is there any way in which some policy might actually be a part of the conversation? Well,
the big policy issue right now, especially coming on the heels of the tax bill, is whether they are going to be brave enough to begin the real conversation on entitlements. That is an absolutely treacherous issue to bring up in an election year. And Mitch McConnell in the Senate has already said it ain't happening here unless there's some Democratic buy-in, which there won't be.
Right. All right. Go ahead quickly.
Oh, I was going to say, remember, the Republicans rely on older voters very heavily, and so that does certainly put things into a different context.
All right. Thanks, all of you, and we'll be right back. It's time now to take a look at perfect timing. We spoke earlier with best-selling author Daniel Pink. His new book is out in early January. It's called When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. You say this is not a how-to book, but a when-to book. Tell people what that means.
Well, we tend to think that timing is an art. We make our decisions about when to do things based on gut instinct and intuition, but timing is actually a science. Across multiple disciplines, there's a huge body of research showing us how to make systematically better, evidence-based decisions about when to do things. And it turns out they have a material effect on our well-being, on our productivity, on our performance, on our creativity, on our health, many, many domains of life.
What I love is also the way in which it's not just, are you a morning person or an evening person, although you have a great explanation and description and a little test on how you can figure out who you are in that group, but it's also when you choose to do certain kinds of thinking, like creative thinking versus, explain that for people.
Absolutely. Well, what a whole range of scientists have found is that the day has a hidden pattern. It's basically a peak, a trough, and a rebound. Now, most of us proceed through the day in that order: peak, trough, rebound. And it turns out we're better off doing analytic work during the peak, which for most of us is the morning. The trough is not good for anything. It's actually a danger zone in many ways. We're better off doing our administrative stuff during the trough. But then during the recovery, it turns out we're better at more creative tasks, tasks that require a little bit more looseness rather than that heads down, locked in approach.
And is that's when the flashes of insight come?
Often, because when we're at our peak, we're very vigilant, right? We're able to keep out distractions. That's a feature when you're doing the analytic work. But when you're doing creative work, you actually want a little bit more looseness. You want to let a few distractions in to mix up the soup a little bit. And so during the recovery period, which again for most of us is the late afternoon, early evening, we do better on what are called insight tasks.
Has human history fouled us up by, which is to say, we needed to create time and have watches and hours so we would know when the bus arrives. Yeah. But did we figure out a system that's basically always fighting with our own natural rhythms?
It's a really, really interesting question because one of the things what I discovered researching time itself is that a lot of things that we think of as natural are completely human inventions designed to corral time. So an hour has no natural substance to it. A minute doesn't have any natural substance to it. Certainly a year does because the planet goes around. A day does because the planet spins on its axis. But beyond that, we're always trying to corral time. And it's very hard to do, and time is a very elusive subject. And one of the things that's happened is that I think as a consequence, when we think about our own performance, we focus on what we're going to do. We focus on often how we're going to do it. We're focused on who we're going to do it with. But we put when questions over there at the kids' table saying that it's not that important. And the science is telling us that it's actually demonstrably important.
Right. It's the thing you should put at the front. One of the things I love about the book is there's a lot of practical news you can use, as we
Absolutely.
say. So give people a little sense of that, both in your day-to-day, but also, you talk, for example, about midlife and the guidance that. So give us a sense of those how-to.
There are all kinds of things. Number one is that if you think about the science of breaks. Not too many years ago, people who stayed up all night were kind of heroes in the workplace because they were tougher than the rest of us. Then the science of sleep began emerging, and we said, no, those people are fools. I think the science of breaks is where the science of sleep was a decade ago, about to break through the surface as a really, really instructive about how we can work better. So we need to take more breaks, period. And one of the best things that I've done myself is that every day I have a break list. I write down 2 breaks I'm going to take during the day. We also know from the science that breaks are better taken with other people rather than solo, even for introverts like me. They're better taken fully detached rather than semi-detached. That is, don't bring your phone. We're better off moving during our breaks than being stationary. We're also better off being near nature. And so what the science is telling us is that if we take these regular breaks, 10, 15 minutes, we're going to feel better, we're going to perform higher. So make a break list. That's one of my favorite tips.
And go outside while you're doing
if you
taking a break.
If you can. But there's
walk.
even evidence that just looking out a window and seeing a tree is better than being in a windowless room.
Let me also ask you about teams, and because how timing works when you're working with lots of other people as well.
Yeah, well, there's some really, really interesting research on how teams synchronize, things like choirs, rowing teams, delivery services. And one of the things that it's so interesting about our nature is that it seems that coordinating with other people, being in sync and in time with other people, there's something fundamentally human about that, and we have a propensity for it. And one of the things that's so interesting about that, if you look at, let's take exercise as an example. Exercise is absolutely good for you, right? It boosts your mood. It's a prophylactic against depression. It helps control your weight. It's all good. Well, there's kind of a new exercise out there, and it's choral singing of all things. Choral singing has benefits that are just extraordinary at the physiological level and the psychological level. It is useful for cancer patients. It improves your immune response. It boosts your mood. So there's something about synchronizing with other people that makes us feel good. It also helps when kids do synchronous activities. They actually afterwards are a little bit more what social psychologists call pro-social. That is, they will play with kids who aren't like them. They're more likely to cooperate. They're more likely to help.
So we all should join roving bands of walking singers.
On our breaks, yes.
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, I think there's some good evidence for, like in schools, that choral groups, not only as kind of an ancillary activity, but as something that actually boosts the moods of kids, improves their social and emotional learning, and could conceivably make them better citizens of the school.
All right, Daniel Pink, that's it. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
Daniel Pink's book is When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. We here at Face the Nation want to wish everyone watching a Merry Christmas, visions of sugar plums, and a very happy holiday season. I'm John Dickerson.